Dorothy Booth heard the knock and opened her door to find her next-door neighbor holding an empty sugar bowl. The 71-year-old psychology professor smiled. She'd taught at university for decades, helped countless students, and never turned away someone asking for help. She had no idea the woman standing on her porch had been watching her routine for weeks, studying when she came and went, calculating the perfect moment to strike. Inside her Lancaster dining room, surrounded by family photos and academic awards, Booth turned toward her kitchen. The butcher knife came down 5 times into her back. As she collapsed, gasping and bleeding, McCarthy grabbed a heavy candelabrum and brought it crashing down on her skull. But she wasn't finished. While Booth lay dying on her own floor, McCarthy pulled out a smaller knife and began sawing through bone and tendon, severing Professor's finger to steal the diamond ring that had marked 50 years of marriage. The Mercedes-Benz in the driveway became McCarthy's escape vehicle. The stolen ring became $20 of crack cocaine. The blood under her fingernails became the DNA evidence that would seal her fate. 16 years later, McCarthy would become the 500th person executed in Texas, her final words echoing through Huntsville's death chamber. "This is not a loss. This is a win." But the numbers tell a darker story. Kimberly McCarthy wasn't born a killer. She came into the world in 1961, grew up in Texas, and for a while, her life looked ordinary enough. She worked as an occupational therapist, waited tables, took care of the elderly in their homes. By all appearances, she was just another face in the crowd, someone you'd trust to help your grandmother or serve you coffee. But beneath that surface, something was already going wrong. McCarthy had developed a taste for crack cocaine that would eventually consume everything good in her life. The drug turned her from a healthcare worker into someone who saw elderly people not as human beings deserving respect, but as walking ATMs waiting to be robbed. By 1988, that transformation was complete, 9 years before Dorothy Booth would die in her dining room. 2 other elderly women in Dallas had already become McCarthy's victims. At least, that's what prosecutors believed. Maggie Harding was 81 years old when McCarthy allegedly entered her home in December 1988. What happened next was a glimpse into the violence that would later play out in Lancaster. Harding was stabbed multiple times, then beaten with a meat tenderizer until she died. The house was ransacked, valuables stolen, and McCarthy disappeared back into the city. 3 days later, 85-year-old Jetty Lucas answered her door for the last time. McCarthy allegedly beat her with both sides of a claw hammer, then stabbed her repeatedly before stealing what she could carry. Lucas died in her kitchen, another elderly woman who had trusted the wrong person. The police found DNA and fingerprint evidence linking McCarthy to both crime scenes, but they couldn't build a case strong enough to stick. McCarthy was indicted for both murders but never brought to trial. She walked free, and for 9 years, she stayed off the radar. Those 9 years weren't a redemption story. McCarthy picked up a forgery charge in 1990, spent 2 years behind bars, and got out on parole. She was supposed to be rehabilitated, ready to rejoin society as a productive citizen. Instead, she was planning her next move. Dorothy Booth lived the kind of life most people would envy. She had spent decades as a psychology professor, helping students understand the human mind. She was respected in her community, financially comfortable, and surrounded by the kind of treasures that come from a lifetime of working and saving. Her Lancaster home was modest but well-appointed, filled with the books, artwork, and jewelry of someone who had lived fully. Most importantly for McCarthy, Booth lived alone. The 2 women were neighbors, which meant McCarthy had plenty of opportunities to observe her target. She could see when Booth came and went, notice her routines, figure out when she'd be most vulnerable. Psychology professors tend to be trusting people. It goes with the territory of trying to understand and help others. Booth would have seen McCarthy as just another neighbor, someone who might need a cup of sugar or a friendly conversation. McCarthy saw something entirely different. She saw an elderly woman with nice jewelry, a luxury car, and no one around to protect her. The planning took weeks. McCarthy wasn't acting impulsively or in the heat of passion. She was working out the details, considering the timing, making sure she could get what she wanted and escape without being caught. This wasn't desperation driving her actions. It was pure predatory greed. The crack cocaine had become her master, and every decision she made revolved around getting money to feed that addiction. Dorothy Booth was just the most convenient source of cash in the neighborhood. The knock on Dorothy Booth's door came the evening, when the Texas heat was finally starting to break, and people were settling in for the night. The professor had probably just finished grading papers or reviewing lecture notes for her next class. Her modest Lancaster home sat quietly in a neighborhood where people knew each other's names and watched out for one another. It was the kind of place where borrowing sugar still meant something, where trust wasn't a foreign concept. McCarthy stood there with her empty sugar bowl, playing the role of a friendly neighbor perfectly. She had probably practiced a conversation, figured out exactly what to say to get Booth to let her inside. The bowl was a prop, carefully chosen because it was innocent, domestic, the kind of thing that would never raise suspicion. "I'm so sorry to bother you, but I'm baking and I've run out of sugar. Could you possibly spare some?" The words came out naturally, like she'd said them a dozen times before. Maybe she had. The beauty of the sugar bowl was its simplicity. Everyone has run out of something while cooking. Everyone has had to ask a neighbor for help. It was a perfect excuse to get inside someone's home. It was a kind of request that neighbors make all the time, especially in a community like Lancaster, where people still looked out for each other. Booth probably smiled, invited McCarthy in, and headed toward her kitchen to help. She would have been thinking about what kind of cake or cookies McCarthy was making, maybe offering some friendly conversation along the way. The psychology professor in her might have even been pleased to connect with a neighbor. McCarthy was thinking about the diamond ring on Booth's finger. As they walked through the house, McCarthy was mapping everything out. Where were the valuable items? How could she control the situation once she made her move? Was anyone else home? Could neighbors see inside? She was operating on a level of planning that Booth couldn't have imagined. While the professor was focused on being helpful, her guest was plotting murder. The dining room was perfect for what McCarthy had in mind. It was away from the windows, private, contained. The heavy furniture meant there were weapons within reach. And Booth would be relaxed here, comfortable in her own space, completely unprepared for what was about to happen. The attack came from behind. Booth never had a chance to defend herself, never saw the knife coming. The first stab wound probably paralyzed her with shock, the realization that her neighbor, someone she trusted, was trying to kill her. In that instant, her worldview collapsed. The woman she'd welcomed into her home, the person she tried to help, was suddenly destroying everything she thought she knew about human nature. The pain would have been overwhelming, but worse than the physical agony was the psychological trauma. Booth had spent her career studying the human mind, trying to understand what makes people tick. She probably worked with troubled individuals, maybe even violent ones. But this was different. This was personal betrayal at its most intimate level. The next 4 wounds finished the job, but McCarthy wasn't done. Each thrust of the blade was deliberate, placed to ensure maximum damage. This wasn't frenzied violence. It was controlled, purposeful killing. McCarthy was making sure there would be no recovery, no chance for Booth to survive and identify her attacker. She was eliminating a witness as much as committing a robbery. The candelabrum was heavy enough to crush bone. McCarthy brought it down on Booth's skull with enough force to ensure she wouldn't survive, wouldn't be able to identify her attacker, wouldn't be able to call for help. The sound of metal against bone echoed to the dining room, a percussive finality to what had started as a simple request for sugar. Blood spattered across family photographs and academic achievements. But even that wasn't enough for McCarthy. She needed that ring, and she was going to get it no matter what it took. While Booth lay dying on her dining room floor, McCarthy pulled out a smaller knife and began working on a finger that wore the diamond ring. This wasn't a quick grab-and-run robbery. This was a deliberate mutilation, carried out while the victim was still alive and aware of what was happening to her. Booth's final moments were spent watching her neighbor saw through her finger, stealing not just her life, but desecrating her body in the process. The ring had been on that finger for 50 years, a symbol of love and commitment that had weathered decades of marriage. Now it was coming off in the worst possible way, taken by someone who saw it as nothing more than a few dollars of drug money. The band had probably grown tight over the years, molded to Booth's finger by time and habit. The ring came free, along with a finger it had adorned for half a century. McCarthy held it up, examining her prize, probably calculating how much money it would bring. She killed a woman, destroyed a family, and traumatized a community, all for a piece of jewelry she'd sell within hours for a fraction of its real value. McCarthy didn't panic. She didn't run screaming from the house or leave obvious evidence behind. Instead, she methodically searched Booth's home, taking the purse, grabbing anything else of value she could carry, and finally stealing the Mercedes-Benz from the driveway. This was the behavior of someone who had done this before, someone who knew how to commit murder and theft without leaving a trail that led directly back to her door. The 1988 murders in Dallas had been good practice. The diamond ring that had cost Dorothy Booth her life was worth far more than the $20 McCarthy got for pawning it. But $20 was enough to buy the crack cocaine she craved. That's what this was really about, not the money itself, but what the money could buy. A professor had died, a family had been destroyed, a community had been shaken, all so that Kimberly McCarthy could get high. McCarthy drove Booth's Mercedes around Dallas, using her victim's car to travel to crack houses and drug deals. She wasn't trying to hide what she'd done, she was celebrating it. The car was like a trophy, proof that she could take whatever she wanted from whoever was too weak to stop her. But cars are traceable, and luxury vehicles driven by crack addicts tend to attract attention. It wouldn't be long before someone connected the dots. When Dorothy Booth didn't show up for her regular activities, people noticed. Former students called. Colleagues wondered where she was. Neighbors saw that her newspapers were piling up. Lancaster wasn't the kind of place where people just disappeared without explanation. The police found her body on July 22nd, one day after the murder. The scene told the story. An elderly woman had been stabbed, beaten, and mutilated in her own home. The missing finger made it clear that this wasn't just a burglary gone wrong. This was deliberate torture carried out for profit. The missing Mercedes-Benz gave investigators their first real lead. Luxury cars don't vanish without a trace, especially when they're being driven by people who don't usually have access to that kind of vehicle. It didn't take long for police to spot Booth's car in areas of Dallas known for drug activity. When they found McCarthy driving a Mercedes, she had Dorothy Booth's blood under her fingernails. DNA testing confirmed what the investigators already suspected. The neighbor who had asked to borrow sugar was the same person who had committed murder to get it. But the physical evidence was just the beginning. When police started digging into McCarthy's background, they found the connections to the 1988 murders in Dallas. Same victim profile, elderly women living alone. Same method, stabbing and beating. Same motive, theft to support drug addiction. 3 murders, spanning 9 years, all committed by the same person. The only difference was at this time, they had enough evidence to make the charges stick. McCarthy's first trial ended in a death sentence, but her lawyers found a way to get it overturned. The appeals court ruled that her confession had been obtained illegally because she had requested a lawyer before talking to police. It was a technicality, but in death penalty cases, technicalities matter. The second trial was even more damaging for McCarthy. Prosecutors had learned from their mistakes, and they came prepared with a case that couldn't be overturned on procedural grounds. They had the DNA evidence, the fingerprints, the stolen car, and the pawn shop records. More importantly, they had the evidence linking McCarthy to the 1988 murders of Maggie Harding and Jetty Lucas. The jury heard about all 3 murders, even though McCarthy was only being tried for killing Dorothy Booth. They learned about the meat tenderizer used to beat Harding to death, the claw hammer that crushed Lucas's skull, and the pattern of targeting elderly women who lived alone and trusted too easily. The defense tried to paint McCarthy as a victim of drug addiction, someone whose judgment had been impaired by crack cocaine. They argued that addiction was a disease, that McCarthy needed treatment rather than execution. But the prosecution painted a different picture, a predator who had deliberately chosen vulnerable victims and killed them in ways designed to maximize her profit and minimize her risk of being caught. The jury saw through the addiction defense. They understood that plenty of people struggle with drug addiction without becoming serial killers. McCarthy had made choices, and those choices had consequences. The second death sentence stuck. By 2013, Texas had carried out 499 executions since resuming capital punishment in 1982. Kimberly McCarthy was scheduled to be number 500, a milestone that attracted national attention and brought protesters from both sides of the death penalty debate to Huntsville. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. Texas had executed more people than any other state, and McCarthy would mark a grim anniversary that forced the country to confront its feelings about capital punishment. Some saw it as proof that the system was working, that the worst criminals were being held accountable for their actions. Others saw as evidence that America had lost its way, that execution had become routine and meaningless. For the families involved, the number didn't matter. What mattered was that Dorothy Booth, Maggie Harding, and Jetty Lucas would finally get the justice they deserved. On June 26, 2013, McCarthy was transferred to the Huntsville unit for her execution. She declined to request a final meal, which meant she was served the same food as every other inmate that day. She met with her spiritual advisor and her lawyer, making peace with the end that had been 16 years in coming. When asked if she had any final words, McCarthy surprised everyone with a statement that seemed to come from a different person than the one who had tortured 3 elderly women for drug money. "This is not a loss. This is a win. You know where I'm going. I'm going home to be with Jesus." It was a moment of apparent redemption, or at least the appearance of it. McCarthy seemed to have found religion during her years on death row, and her final words suggested that she believed her execution would lead to salvation rather than damnation. Whether that transformation was real or just another performance will never be known. What matters is that at 6:37 p.m., Kimberly McCarthy was pronounced dead, becoming the 500th person executed in Texas since the death penalty was reinstated.